So just a quick disclaimer before we get really into it. Advanta IRA and our employees, we do not provide investment advice or endorse any product. All information provided here today is for informational purposes only, and all parties are encouraged to consult with their attorneys, accountants, and financial advisors before entering into any type of investment or making any taxable decisions for themselves personally. My name is Alex Perny. I've been with Advanta since 2012. I'm a certified IRA services professional. I really enjoy what I do here at Advanta. I started doing this back in 2012 and I started doing investments for clients. I have plenty of experience doing all manner of different types of different fundings, different closings. I was involved in over 1,200 different investments before I kind of transitioned into my new role here in doing education and marketing for our company. So if you have a question, even if it may not necessarily be directly specific to checkbook control, or maybe it has something else to do with self-directed IRAs in general, please feel free to ask. I am happy to answer those questions. And if you would like a consultation afterwards, please feel free to reach out to me directly. All my direct contact information is on the slide here in front of you. So what is a self-directed IRA? We'll kind of start with a little bit of the basics, then work our way into the specifics of checkbook control and what that actually means for a self-directed IRA. But self-directed IRAs give owners complete control over their retirement funds. More specifically, checkbook control gives them complete control over exactly how those funds are directed and administered. Self-directed IRAs can use alternative assets to create diversity and build retirement and wealth, and the different types of assets, although there are a few listed right up here, are as varied as the day is long. So just understand that maybe just because you don't necessarily see the deal up here that you're maybe looking to do, or the specific type of asset you're looking to pursue, the guiding principle with self-direction is that so long as the asset is not held on a traded securities market, we can probably hold it and it can probably be done within a self-directed IRA. And the main reason people haven't heard about this is that larger banks and financial institutions, they just don't have the specialized service and the time, if you will, to administer high maintenance assets, such as things like real estate, things like promissory notes, things that take a very specialized touch and a lot of specific knowledge in order to make sure that they are administered, record kept, and ultimately acquired properly within the scope of the IRA. There's roughly about 4% of the total IRA market is self-directed, and the retirement market, as far as a figure of exactly how much capital is invested, is somewhere in the neighborhood of about $27 to $31 trillion of invested capital within retirement plans. Now, in the context of doing self-direction and more specifically checkbook control, it's not going to be necessarily defined to one type of IRA. You can do checkbook control and you can self-direct any number of different types of plans. Most people, for whatever reason, think you have to have a specific type of IRA in order to do this. Namely, people think that you have to have a Roth IRA, which is just inherently not true. You can self-direct any of the plans that are up on your screen right now. And for those of you that are just listening, I'll kind of go through them here real quick. You can self-direct and checkbook control a traditional IRA, a Roth IRA. If you're a self-employed individual, you can do a SEP IRA. Any type of former employer plan can be rolled into a self-directed IRA, whether that be pre or post-tax. So things like thrift savings plans for our armed services, old 401ks, 403bs, governmental 457 plans, cafeteria plans, larger administered, pension plans, if you were a unionized workforce or part of a collective bargaining workforce, simple IRAs. You can even self-direct a health savings or education savings account. So just because maybe you're thinking that, hey, I have to do this investment through a certain type of IRA, don't let that be a guiding principle. Understand that you can do these types of self-directed investments and do checkbook control through any number of these plans. You can even combine these plans into one self-directed checkbook control type LLC as well. So there's a lot of different leeway. There's a lot of different ways to do this. You don't just have to have one type of plan in order to accomplish that. Now, we mentioned that it's alternative assets that you do within self-directed IRAs. And for those of you that may be watching this later or are just trying to reference back to the slides, again, which the slides are uploaded as a handout to this presentation, I just like to put it up there. We're not going to kind of go through each one of them. Each one of these different types of assets has a whole presentation that could be put against it. But for the most part, the main thing that most of our clients utilize is things like real estate. And real estate, you can kind of do any any real project that you're looking to do can be accomplished through an IRA, and specifically checkbook control. It doesn't have to just be single family homes ready to rent. You can do a ground up rehab, you can buy land, you can speculate, you can do really whatever you'd like to. Whatever makes the most financial sense for you in your situation, or whatever you feel the most comfortable in, and what you think you can make the most money at, is ultimately really what should guide your decision on what type of asset class to purchase, and also obviously advice of whomever is advising you on your financial purchases. So here's just some of them enumerated up there for you. Now let's get into kind of what you're here for: checkbook control with an IRA. Now, checkbook IRAs, there's a little bit of definition that needs to go into the front end of this. Some people, and I get this call a lot, and it's by no fault of the person. It's just kind of information that's out there isn't always the best information. Is that people think that that a checkbook IRA is a type of IRA specifically. It's not. What I really want people to understand is that using checkbook control, or when people talk about checkbook IRAs, it is a way that you structure the investments within an IRA. The IRA and its fundamentals, if you go through the IRS's code and you look through the IRS's website, you will find nothing that says checkbook IRA on it. It is not a thing. It is the way that you structure the investments underneath of that account that ultimately gives you checkbook control, or allows you to write checks and hold the checkbook for the IRA. So the way that an IRA works in general, if you don't have checkbook control, is that you have it held as a custodial account, meaning that a custodian, in this case Advanta, will administer the assets in cash for the IRA. And if you're not using an LLC or checkbook control, that means that we retain all of the uninvested cash. We pay all the bills at the direction of the client. So if you have a piece of real estate and it needs a new water heater, you get someone out there to replace the water heater. You simply go on your AdvantaIRA.com portal, have us rip the check, and they're paid the following business day, which obviously does add a little bit of lag time into things, but it is fully record kept by us. You get the benefit of us having copies of checks, invoices. We can really show that everything is being done and kind of help with all of that bookkeeping. Now, with a checkbook control account, instead of the administrator and custodian directly holding the cash and assets, an entity, and we'll get into the different types of entities here in a minute, but an entity, in most cases an LLC, will be formed. It will be a single member, for the most part, manager managed entity that the IRA will be the shareholder of, meaning that the IRA directly owns a private entity that then in turn that entity, if you're named as the manager of that entity, will be the one writing checks and having checkbook control. So again, remember, it is a structure, not necessarily a type of an account that you're looking at with this, which is an important distinction to remember, because I like to make sure people understand exactly what they're getting into when it comes to any type of financial arrangement. It's important to understand exactly what's going on, so that way if you ever have to explain it to someone like a CPA, or even if you have an issue and you need help with your custodian, it's important to understand exactly what you've structured and exactly how things work in order to make sure that you're doing the most to make sure that you're getting the most out of the structure. So with the checkbook control account, the client personally attains control over the cash by using that third-party bank account, and then you're able to issue payments directly out of that account and receive deposits directly back into that entity as well, without having to come through the custodian first. So that's how you get that checkbook control aspect of the IRA, by using the auspice of some type of entity between the custodian and the ultimate investment. Now, there's a few different ways that you can achieve checkbook control. You don't necessarily have to use an LLC. Some people elect to use a trust. Now, I will say that the lion's share of people that come to Advanta use an LLC. It's a bit more flexible. There's a little bit more leeway with the way that you can direct your investments with an LLC. It may be a little bit more expensive than a trust in some aspects, but you need to understand really that these are two different types of entities. There are two different ways to accomplish relatively the same thing, but they do have their own set of rules with each, and it's really important to understand it before you go forward with it. So with either of these, you have a few different aspects you need to look at. You need to look at the management, who writes the checks, how the assets are taken, and how the IRA interacts with that entity, because it is a very important distinction to make. So with a limited liability company, or LLC, you have a manager. So you have a manager managed operating agreement, which will show how everything with that entity works. Now, to have checkbook control, obviously Advanta, so the custodian, is not going to be writing checks and doing everything. So who is going to be doing that? That is going to be the manager named in that operating agreement. In the LLC's case, it can be the client. So the client directly can write checks, sign contracts for closing, sign sale documents and everything. That is whom the authority to do everything with that entity is vested in. It's the manager. The title of the assets are going to be in the name of that LLC, and the IRA will be a member of the LLC. So what is a member? Think of it as another way. It's another way to say shareholder. It's another way to say owner. But it is important that when you're looking at this, that you understand some of the legal terminology that goes into showing what your IRA is in relation to the entity that you choose to checkbook control with. So to real quick, an LLC has a manager. That can be the client. The checks are written by the manager. The title of the assets is in the name of the LLC, and the IRA's relationship to that entity is that it is a member of the LLC. Now, with the LLC, one reason that some people do like to go with a trust is that LLCs have to pay an annual registration to whatever state that they are registered in. Keep in mind that with regard to IRA-owned LLCs, you do not have to register the LLC in the state that you currently live in, which is a really good thing, especially for people that live in states that have a very high administrative interaction or very expensive administration for their states. A lot of the states on the West Coast, so California, Washington, Oregon, some of the states in the Northeast, like maybe Massachusetts, New York, some of the ones in the Midwest, Illinois, cheaper ones that a lot of our clients look to. And again, this is something that you need to get advice from on whomever might be advising you on how to do this, or the person drafting your LLC. States like Florida, Georgia, Texas are typically a little bit cheaper for LLCs and maybe have a little bit of a less involved requirement on an annual basis for keeping your LLC registered on an annual basis. But keep in mind that that is an additional cost to an LLC that is not borne by a trust. Now, with a trust, the IRA owner cannot be the trustee. You are acting as a fiduciary at that point, and IRS rules state that you cannot act in a fiduciary capacity to your own IRA. So with a trust, you have to have a clear independent third party act as the trustee. So the person that's going to be writing the checks and managing that checkbook control entity has to be a third party from the client directly. And it can't be a disqualified individual, meaning, we'll get into that in a slide or two. And then the assets, just like with an LLC being in that name, it's in the name of the trust, but it is bifurcated with regards to how the IRA is involved in the actual setup of that trust. The IRA is going to be the grantor and the beneficiary. So unlike with the LLC, where all of the benefit and cash come directly from the shareholder, the trust has two different parts. It has the grantor, which is the individual which grants the assets or property to that entity. So the IRA is the one adding the cash into that trust, and then whom gets the benefit of the performance of the assets held within that trust, which is the beneficiary. So the IRA is going to be named in two places on the trust as opposed to just one place on the LLC. Now, that might be a lot of information, but keep in mind that that's something that you really need to look at when you look at checkbook control, that you do have options. It's not just an LLC and it's not just a trust. There's a lot of different places I've seen out there online and in the industry that they'll say, hey, you have to use this way or the other. They both have their benefits, they both have their drawbacks. Just understand there is choice, but each one does have a cost benefit for that. Now, with regards to a trust, let's break this down a little bit further, because again, it's really important to understand when you go to choose one, what really goes into either or. And I saw someone raise their hand. Please, if you have a question, type it into the chat box. Again, we might get to it a little bit later. I'll look at it and I'll certainly answer it as they come up. So make sure that you do answer those. If you do have any questions, just go ahead and type those into the chat box. Just double check and make sure. Okay, no questions yet. So now, with a trust, there's many different kinds of trust. Oh, looks like we do have a question. Okay. So with a trust, there are many different kinds of trust out there. Trusts have been in existence for hundreds of years as far as how they're codified in U.S. law. So there's a lot of different types of them out there. You don't necessarily need to pick one over the other, but it's important to know that, you know, it's not one size fits all with regards to choosing the type of entity if you go with a trust. There's revocable trust, meaning that you can at any point dissolve the trust and essentially file everything back into the grantor or the beneficiary. There are irrevocable trusts, not something we see a lot of with IRAs because, as the name indicates, being irrevocable, it's really hard to revoke it. So if you need to change something, it's hard to do. There's special needs trusts that can benefit individuals with disabilities. There's life insurance trusts. Not all of these necessarily work with an IRA, so making sure that you get the right one for your IRA is important. Most of the time, people will just choose what is templated as a personal property trust. It's nothing too crazy. It basically is a personal property trust is what's called a grantor beneficiary trust, meaning that the grantor and the beneficiary are the same entity, which is important because the IRA would need to be the grantor and the beneficiary of a trust. So again, the most common type being for IRAs to use is a personal property trust. You know, don't think that that's something that you're going to add your own personal assets in. It's just kind of the naming convention that's used for that specific type of entity. Now, the parties in a trust, the grantor is the one that contributes the assets to the trust. The trustee manages the assets of the trust, and the beneficiary is the ultimate recipient of that trust. So just good things to understand, especially when it comes to trusts. There's a lot of different flavors of these things, and you don't necessarily need to get too far into the weeds with a specific type of trust for an IRA. Again, most common type being a personal property grantor beneficiary trust. So again, with the personal property trust, you have a bank account, you have a third-party trustee, which maintains your checkbook control. Now, there are some other types of trusts out there that get confused a little bit when it comes into the specifics of a checkbook control trust. Now, in the state of Florida, we have land trusts. That is not inherently a checkbook control trust. They're treated just like real estate. They don't necessarily have a bank account. They do have a trustee, but they don't always work in the same way. So it's important to do the research with regard to who is actually going to be handling the drafting of these things, because you want to make sure you actually get the right type of trust for your IRA. A land trust not always being the best fit. Now, LLCs, these by and large are going to be the most popular type of entity to choose for individuals with IRAs. And the biggest reason for that is simply because the IRA owner can be the manager of that LLC. Now, remember back to the trust portions that we were covering. The trustee, so whom signs the check, who has that checkbook control, cannot be the manager. So if you as the client want to have checkbook control, there's really not a huge benefit, at least in my eyes, to using a trust if that's really what you want to have the checkbook control for, because it's not much different than just contacting us as the custodian to get a check written, because you still have to contact a third party in order to get something written or signed. So the moving parts of an LLC, the members are the shareholders, or the equity holders. The manager, that can be thought of as the officer or the president, the decision maker of that. And the operating agreement is the really important part of having an LLC for an IRA. In almost any state, you can go and register on their online portal and set up and register an LLC. You don't necessarily have to do anything other than just pay some fees and get an LLC set up. While that's all well and good, and that is an essential step in the process of setting up an LLC, it is not the only thing that needs to be done. We need to have an operating agreement drafted, and the state does not give you an operating agreement. That's where you need to have a third party that is qualified to draft such a document, make one for your IRA, because the operating agreement is going to show the IRA as the member. It is going to show that it is manager managed. It is going to name the manager, and it is going to create the LLC as an investment in the IRA's eyes. So that's the really important part, is that yes, a lot of people have, LLCs, and I hear it a lot, and I heard it a lot when I was doing investments for clients. Is they would come to me and say, "Hey, I already have an LLC that I'd like to use for this. I set it up with the state years ago." I would encourage you, if you're going to be doing anything for an IRA, start fresh, use a new LLC, start from the very beginning. Even if you had an LLC sitting out there for a couple of years and you haven't ever funded it, just do yourself a favor, and if you're going to be doing something like this, start from the very beginning, do something new, make sure that it has been set up and solely used just for your IRA. We got a question that popped up. So the question is that, can I personally pay to establish the LLC, or does the payment have to come out of the IRA? It's a really good question, and it's very much a chicken and egg scenario, because rules regarding IRAs is that IRAs are responsible for paying any and all expenses directly related to their assets in the IRA. So for example, if a piece of real estate, if you need to pay property taxes, has to be paid from by the IRA. Any and all expenses related to closing has to be paid from by the IRA. An LLC is going to have expenses. And if the LLC does not necessarily have cash in it yet, how exactly is the LLC going to pay that expense to have itself set up? It has to be paid to be set up, so how does that get paid? Now, most states will just say, hey, put in a credit card and pay the fee for the filing for your LLC. While it would be wrong for me to say that I know that clients have never done that, and plenty of them probably have. It's my job to give you the most correct information and give you the tools to do things as correct as possible. Now, while it may not necessarily be a route that everyone can take, you would need to essentially, in the most perfect scenario, have a friend or some other third party pay that fee for the registration for the first year, and then just have us write them a check, or write them a check out of the LLC. Would be what I would recommend. Now, have people done it? Have people had issues with it? No. But again, if it were to be looked at, I would much rather have, if I were to ever be audited, have everything in my IRA that I've worked so hard to put in there be as protected as possible, because and have done everything as correct as possible. So we got another question here before we move on to the next slide. I know you were talking about IRAs, but can we self-direct a 401k plan for the same activities? Absolutely. 401ks, they have some other cool aspects where you can checkbook control without even needing an entity like a trust or an LLC. And you can certainly self-direct them in many different ways with different types of strategies with how those plans are administered and custodized. So yes, you can absolutely do that. And last one before we move on, can an existing 403B be converted to a Roth self-directed IRA? Yes, it can. Good questions. Okay. Rules for checkbook IRA LLCs must be manager managed. Now, what does that mean? So most LLCs, if you were just to get a boilerplate operating agreement, would be member managed, because outside of an IRA, typically if you were to set up a personal LLC, you would be the member and you would also want to be the manager. So member managed makes sense. But if the IRA were to be the managing member of a checkbook control LLC, you as the client wouldn't be able to sign anything. Advanta would still have to sign everything as the administrator of that account. So it's very important to make that distinction. It has to be manager managed. It can include more than one IRA, but ownership percentages are based on the initial contributions. So if you and a partner of any type are going to contribute funds to an LLC, if you both contribute $50,000 to that LLC, well, then you both have 50% membership. But if one individual contributes $90,000, the other contributes 10, you can't have 50-50 membership. It has to be defined against the capital contributions initially going in to that LLC. And if the other individual is a disqualified individual, that can also affect your ability to maybe make contributions later on in the future, And also keep in mind that if you do a multi-member LLC, that you do get into an aspect where you are then going to have to file a federal tax return as a partnership, because single member LLCs are generally regarded as disregarded entities that most of the time are not required to file a federal tax return. So even though you may not have any taxable liability for a multi-member LLC, if it is indeed owned by all IRAs, you are going to have an additional burden of at least having to file a corporate return every year. That could definitely potentially influence the way that you want to go with regards to how you structure these assets. So keep that in mind, that you can do multi-member LLCs. You can have as many partners as you'd like, but it's definitely going to maybe add some complications and some additional layers in that, depending on how you want to go forward with it. And with regard to adding more money into it, especially down the road, you can certainly add more money into multi-member LLCs, but you're going to have to make sure that the percentages and the ratios that you add money back into that are going to be maintained. So if in the future, in that scenario where you had someone contributing $50,000 and another contributing $50,000, if you want to put more money into that LLC, you would need to put in 50-50 ratios. Both people would have to contribute at the same rate. Otherwise, one IRA's investment would be inflated and the other individuals would be diluted. So that's a very important distinction to make as well. And that may also get into having issues with prohibited transactions. So it's really important that if you do a multi-member LLC, it's something to really keep an eye on. Let's see, what else do we need to cover on this slide? Oh, liability protections. So one big thing that a lot of people like to point out, and this does hold true for personally held assets for a certain degree of things, is that you use a limited liability company or an LLC for liability protections. At least in the state of Florida, the Florida Supreme Court typically does not extend liability protections to the shareholders of a single member LLC. They treat it as a pass-through, so there wouldn't necessarily be as much of a liability protection, or any, in some cases. You would really need to kind of make sure you're doing your research before you make your decision based on simply liability protections for that. Now, if you want to look up the Florida case, if you search the Olmstead case in the Florida records, that's what's going to bring up the liability extensions for single member versus multi-member partnership liability extensions. And if you want to look up a little bit more case law supporting the actual use of IRAs and LLCs, the big one that kind of created the basis for this was a case called Swanson v. Commissioner. Another later case was a tax court memo of the T.L. Ellis case. Now, both of these cases have issues. They are not perfect, and they are not necessarily a green light for any and everything you'd like to do with these types of structures. But it's a good place to start if you would like to get a little bit more information and maybe educate yourself on the legalities of what you're specifically trying to do with checkbook control. We got a couple questions before we get to the next slide. Do banks give real estate LLCs home loan on LLC? What this individual is asking is that can you get a loan for your IRA-owned property in an LLC? Yes, you can, but most banks will not do that. It has to be what's called non-recourse financing, and that is kind of another whole topic in and of itself. The short answer is that yes, you can get financing, but it is significantly more complicated than just a yes or no answer. It has to be the specific type of financing, and IRAs are going to then be exposed to a specific type of tax, which we'll get into actually on the slide as well. If an IRA, even if a single member, why not protected? So we have a couple of questions about asset protection. So IRA assets, yes, they can be protected from creditor actions extending from actions of yourself personally. So if you had some type of judgment against you, typically that's not going to extend into your retirement accounts. But the IRA in and of itself is its own entity. If it owns a piece of real estate, it can be named in a lawsuit if there was a liability action. Now, if you owned a property through a single member IRA-owned LLC, that LLC may not necessarily protect the other assets held within that IRA because it is treated as a pass-through. So just keep in mind that when I say liability protection, we're talking about actions created, we're talking about judgments and actions and suits created by the assets or actions of the LLC, not necessarily you personally. Let's see, can you structure additional LLCs or trusts to be a partner with yourself as a dual member? Yes, you can, but again, that's going to add a definite degree of complexity and also requirements for specific tax reporting. Here's a great question. Robert asks, are there restrictions or prohibitions on adding additional funds to a single member IRA-owned LLC? The answer to that is no, because you're never going to have a dilution or inflation event of the actual shareholder's stake in that entity. So if you were to have a single member IRA-owned LLC that you would put $1,000 into, whether you add in $100,000 next, $50,000, or $1 million, the IRA's ownership in that LLC is always going to remain at 100. So you don't have to worry about the increase or the decrease in the basis of anyone's ownership in that. So that's one nice thing about keeping it as a single member LLC is you don't have to worry about membership percentages changing with regards to additional capital contributions. Keep the questions rolling in. Let's get through some more slides and then I'll take a break and answer some more. So with IRAs, there are prohibited transactions. There are things that you cannot buy. There are people that you cannot directly engage with in the course of investing these types of accounts. You cannot directly buy, or an IRA cannot be named as the primary beneficiary of a life insurance policy. Those are paid out tax-free. I would create a cyclical, kind of tax shelter that the IRS identified. They got that out of there. You cannot buy anything, excuse me, that derives its value from collectability. So things like antiques, rare bottles of wine, artwork, stamps. You can buy coins that are traded strictly on their bullion content value, but you cannot trade them as a rarity for their rarity. It has to just be simply based on the price of the bullion content. Now, any transaction between a plan and a disqualified person is another thing to watch out for. So if you were to just say, let's say your child had a rental property that you wanted to buy with your IRA, you couldn't buy that with your IRA. You also can't utilize an LLC to help obfuscate the fact that you are trying to do that. The intent is to purchase it, and you go through either step transactions of having it conveyed to a third party and then buying it from that third party. It is seen as just as bad in the IRS's rules. So you cannot directly purchase or sell anything to or from a disqualified person, or they can't also receive a direct benefit from your IRA's assets. So those disqualified individuals are your mother, father, son, daughter, spouse, or anyone that's named as a beneficiary of your IRA. So if you look at your family tree, you just draw a line up and down, and those are the people that you cannot directly deal with and that cannot directly get a benefit from your IRA-owned assets. Now, brothers and sisters, aunt and uncles, in-laws, those are not considered disqualified individuals, so have fun, but it's just something important to remember because a lot of people do like to invest with their family. Now, to the question of financing, an individual asked earlier about getting a bank loan. If you were to do that, you would be subjecting the IRA to a tax. Now, I really kind of hesitate to get into how that tax is calculated. It maybe is a little bit more of a complex conversation to have, but just keep in mind that if you finance anything within an IRA specifically, you're going to have to file a tax return for your IRA, and you're also going to have to pay taxes on the amount of profit that is generated from the leveraged portion of that asset. Now, if you pay the loan off, this tax and reporting requirement goes away, but it does bring up a good point, is that this tax of debt-related finance tax is not applied to 401k accounts. So if you want to buy property utilizing debt leverage, being able to do that through a 401k is a huge benefit because it is exempted from UDFI liabilities. So something to keep in mind if maybe you're looking at utilizing an IRA for checkbook control, or maybe you're self-employed and you have the ability to use a 401k, definitely something to consider. Now here for the individuals, I know I explained it on the last slide, but just so that way, if you're downloading the slides, you can kind of see it laid out for you of exactly what the disqualified individuals look like as far as something that is printed out. So again, remember, looking directly up and down from you, these are the people you cannot directly buy or sell something to. You can partner with them on a new deal. So let's say you and your spouse wanted to, both put your IRAs into a Checkbook Control LLC. Now, let's say you wanted to do it in a multi-member LLC. You can do that. You can start one like that, but you can't maybe necessarily add more money in later. You can't buy your spouse out. You can do it with a parent or a child. So just keep in mind that you can do these things with disqualified individuals as partnerships, but you cannot directly buy or sell anything to them. It's an important distinction to make. All right, got a couple questions. Let's see. When you talk about prohibited people, I hear the term extending service. How do you interpret extending service and being the manager of the entity? It's not, I haven't mentioned it already. That's more of maybe a specific thing that you possibly saw somewhere. But essentially, an IRA owner is disqualified from providing service to their IRA. Now, that is frustratingly vague by the IRS, and also disqualified individuals are prohibited from extending service to an IRA-owned asset. Now, what that would mean essentially is that let's say my daughter owned a landscaping business, and I own property through my IRA LLC. I could not hire my daughter's landscaping company to come and do landscaping work for my IRA-owned property. That would be a clear violation of a service being extended. Now, I tell people, when it comes to services, yes, it's vague. As a manager acting as a service provider, so long as they're not physically doing any improvements or maintenance on the property, I think you're fine. You can coordinate, you can inspect, but when it comes to actually, rolling a paintbrush or swinging a hammer, that's where you really got to draw the line. And the same thing goes with disqualified individuals acting in a service capacity to your IRA as well. Let's see. Kyle asks, if I invest in a private placement with a group of people and they use debt to purchase a large multifamily, am I still on the hook for unrelated debt finance income tax? Yes, possibly you are. If it's going to depend a lot on how they structured that entity. If they are electing to be taxed as a C Corp, no. If they are taxed as a partnership, then potentially yes. Let's see, Eric, great question, especially with the current state of affairs. Yes, I'm actually going to be teaching a class next week. I would really highly recommend that you circle back next Tuesday about buying crypto in an IRA. We do encourage clients to use LLCs, and in very broad terms, yes, the LLC would be what actually interfaces with your particular brokerage choice, such as Kraken or Coinbase. And then you would be the one holding the wallet for that. But check back next Tuesday. We're going to have a full hour and a half directly on buying crypto in an IRA. Definition of spouse being legally married, yes. Did I understand? Did I say beneficiary is disqualified person? Yes, if you're named as a beneficiary of your IRA, they become disqualified. And last question before we move on, if you formed an LLC partnership between husband and spouse and the LLC throws off income, is that income subject to self-employment taxes? No. So with these, remember that these are tax sheltered accounts. So if the only members of that LLC are tax qualified entities such as IRAs, that is not employment taxable income. They're treated as pass-throughs. So the taxable liability, if there was one, would pass on to the member. And since that member is a tax exempt entity as an IRA, wouldn't have any taxes associated with that. All right, let's continue. Let's get to a case study. Let's see how this works in real practice. So this is Joe's real estate deal. Joe has $150,000 in a traditional IRA, and he's interested in investing in real estate. So he decides to buy a single-family rental property, and he finds one for sale for $100,000. He needs an additional $20,000 of work to get it rent ready. So their projected monthly rents after that are going to be about $1,000 a month. So how can he get this done? Remember, we have really three choices at this point. We can use the IRA directly, we can use a trust, we can use an LLC. So directly through the IRA, how does that work? Joe opens the account, and in any of these scenarios, the first step is that the account has to be open. The biggest pain point that I see when people go to buy anything, and this has to do with funding a mortgage, buying a piece of real estate, cryptocurrency, whatever it is, if you are trying to do something through an IRA, first and foremost, get that account open. So that way we can start working for you to make sure things are done correctly. So in this case, he's buying it directly through the IRA, completes the IRA application, transfers or rolls over funds, and then we get the account number issued for him within 24 hours. He's identified the property, so we need to make sure that one, that contract is written in the name of the IRA, which would be Advanta IRA for benefit of Joe Smith's IRA. Client approves the contract. Client approves the contract. We execute it. We issue the escrow deposit from the IRA. Now we go through a standard closing. We review all of the documents. The client needs to approve all of those, but we as the administrator of that account are going to sign the contract. We're going to review the deed, sign estoppels, prorations, anything that needs to be done for that property closing. Advanta signs, the client approves. Now at closing, we wire all the funds, and then Joe at that point goes out and finds a tenant and starts renting the property. The IRA starts collecting those rents, and that's the return on his investment that he's seeing is that $1,000 a month of rent. So every year, minus expenses, he's bringing in $12,000 a year minus any expenses. Now he directs all the expenses to be paid by the IRA. So us at Advanta, we're going to be paying taxes, we're going to be paying insurance, everything's going to be paid directly out of that IRA account directly. And then you can track everything directly through the online portal that we provide. And keep in mind that that's one of the benefits of using the custodian like Advanta as opposed to checkbook control, is that if you're not the best at record keeping, or you'd like a little bit more comprehensive service, we take care of all that if we're not using an LLC or checkbook control. If you're using checkbook control, you give up a little bit. That's kind of one of the trade-offs, that yes, you do get to be able to write checks, you are able to sign contracts and everything, but you're responsible for keeping records of all checks and all payments, all expenses, contracts, rental contracts, everything like that ultimately becomes your responsibility at that point. Now let's look at using a checkbook control LLC. Again, can't stress it enough. First thing to do, open the account. Now, after that happens, Joe chooses the state to set up the LLC in. Remember, this can be any state that you want. You don't necessarily have to choose the state in which you live. Now, other states proclaim different benefits. For the most part, since this is not a personally owned LLC, the privacy concerns of that are promoted by some states are a bit moot. Namely, places like Wyoming and Nevada promote those a lot. I will say that the majority of our clients choose states in the Southeast or Delaware to incorporate their LLC in. So Joe will choose the state to set up the LLC in, chooses the name. He will provide his either his own tax or legal service to file the articles and do the operating agreement, or we can recommend someone. We have a book of business that our clients have worked with and they've been happy with. We don't have any type of financial agreement with any of these people. They've just been service providers to our clients in the past. They've treated our clients well, and we feel comfortable giving their names out to provide the service to our client. So after that, we make sure that the IRA is listed as 100% owner. The operating agreement shows the IRA as the member. And just like with that contract, if you're not using an LLC, it's Advanta IRA for benefit of Joe Smith, IRA number XYZ. Now at that point, we sign the operating agreement on behalf of the IRA, and then we send either a check or wire to that LLC's bank account, and you're off to the races. So once the funds are in that LLC, Joe then has full reign to sign any closing documents, make any deals. Doesn't need to contact Advanta every time he needs a check or every time he needs to do something. Simply just goes out and performs that action for the LLC. Doesn't need to get us involved every time. The only time we need to be involved in something is at the end of the year. We'll need to get an annual update of the value of the LLC, which would simply just be an unaudited balance sheet of the holdings of that entity. So cash plus assets minus any liabilities would be what we need to be shown at the end of every year. Um, Kyle, if you have questions about fees, it varies. It can vary. I'm happy to go over that specifically with you if you just want to give me a call or shoot me an email afterwards. It's not necessarily kind of a flat rate for everyone. It can depend on, maybe if you're not investing a whole lot, it might be a little bit different than if you're investing more money, it might be a flat rate. So it just really kind of depends. We try to be very flexible and get you the best situation possible for our billing for that. So I'd encourage you just to give me a call and I can give you an exact quote on what that would be. Okay. Now, using a trust. Again, first thing we do, we open the account. Now, this is where we have a divergence from the LLC. So now we need to have a trust document drafted. Trusts are not registered with any particular state. So you don't necessarily have to choose a state, but you have to choose what type of trust that you would like to have. Trusts are not public record. So if you're extremely concerned about anonymity or of public record presence of your name and information, trust might be a little bit better. But keep in mind that there is the trade-off of being able to sign your own checks and personally checkbook control versus the LLC versus having to have a trustee do it. Again, the grantor beneficiary is going to be the IRA. And then just like with the LLC and the closing documents, Joe has to approve everything before we sign the trust agreement. We fund the trust account, and then from there, Joe coordinates with his trustee to have everything coordinated, paid, done, signed, sealed, and delivered for the actions of that trust, just as he would have done personally with the LLC. In my opinion, the trust is most similar to just doing it directly through Advanta. If you want to, if you're very passionate, if you will, about having checkbook control and you don't want to be your own manager, a trust might be a good fit. Again, we do not see a whole lot of trust being utilized for this capacity. Excuse me, for that reason of not being able to act as the trustee. So keep that in mind. They are available. There are options, but it is certainly not the more popular of the three to go. Let's see. Patricia asks, can you buy crypto or foreign currency without using a trust or an LLC? Foreign currency, yes. Crypto, not at Advanta. We need to use an LLC or a trust. And really, it's going to be a much better fit with the nature of cryptocurrency and how it trades and how people typically interact with cryptocurrency markets. Utilizing an LLC will almost always give you a better experience than doing it through a custodian, just for the speed in which you're able to trade and adapt to market conditions. Now we're getting towards the end, so keep the questions coming in. But an important thing to understand is that how do you get cash out of a trust or an LLC if you want to take a personal distribution? One of the worst things you can do is that if you want to take a personal distribution, is write yourself a check out of the trust or the LLC. That is one of the more common mistakes that I see, and it's one of the easiest to avoid. First thing you need to do is write a check from that LLC or that trust back to Advanta. Then we deposit the cash, and then we issue you a check or a wire for what you want to take out, because we have to do IRS 1099 reporting on anything that you take out of those accounts. All right. We kind of already covered this. You can partner funds with checkbook control IRAs. So if you want to be a personal partner, not just using IRAs of disqualified individuals, you can partner disqualified individuals, personal funds. But keep in mind that if you do this, you have to be very careful about about potentially adding any more partners into the deal. And then also making sure that all income and expenses are properly split if you're going to be doing something like that as well. Now, pros and cons of buying through the IRA directly, and then we'll get in here in a second to the pros and cons of checkbook control. The pros of buying directly through the IRA, it is certainly much easier to keep an arm's length from your IRA funds. If you are very concerned about prohibited transactions, doing things directly through the IRA administrator is by far and away probably one of the best and easiest ways for you to keep arm's length. You're less likely to engage in prohibited transactions, and also you have the benefit of our extensive record keeping experience. You don't have to worry about if you paid a contractor a check 5 years ago about digging through your own records for that. It's as easy as calling us. We can get you a copy of anything that you need, typically within 24 hours. The cons, you do have the potential for higher fees if you have multiple assets, and you don't have the ability to write checks immediately for purchases. Let's see, I got a couple questions. Can an LLC buy a business or real estate in another country? Yes, it can. But when it comes to buying property in foreign countries, there is a lot of other considerations to give. Especially, you have to deal with what that host country's requirement on foreign direct investment is. I have had a lot of experience buying real estate for clients in Central and South America, and for the most part, most countries, Mexico and South, require that you hold a a a business that has registered in that country as the holding company for the real estate that you in turn then own the shares of. It's kind of an odd scenario that you have to go through, but a lot of foreign countries have that for foreign direct investors. The United States doesn't have that requirement. So the answer is yes. A little bit of a more detailed answer is that it might be administratively infeasible or just too cumbersome for some countries. But yeah, you can certainly look into it, and there's nothing prohibitive on the IRS side um, for that. Let's see. Would you say that there is a minimum amount you recommend clients to come to Advanta with to make all the costs associated with checkbook control worthwhile? Not necessarily. I've seen people come with $5,000 accounts for investing in cryptocurrency that have done well. I've seen people that maybe didn't have a good experience with just what they bought and they had $100,000 accounts. It's really kind of most determinant on what your expected rate of return is and what you're trying to accomplish. I wouldn't necessarily say dollar figure wise there's a mark. I will say that we don't really see too many. The bottom threshold of accounts we typically see is about $5,000. But again, we don't have an account minimum, so take that for what it's worth. Let's see. Did I hear you correctly? A beneficiary is disqualified person. Yes. If you name someone as a beneficiary, they become disqualified. Are stepchildren considered disqualified individuals? Not inherently, but they can become. Let's say you have a stepchild. So here's a situation when that could become disqualified. Let's say you're married. Your spouse has children from a previous marriage, and your spouse is the primary beneficiary of your account. You pass away, your spouse inherits your account. Now, if you had dealt with those stepchildren, or let's say that you had, let's say they were living in a property that your IRA owned, then that would automatically, at the moment of your death, would become prohibitive. So while on face value, maybe some of those people aren't necessarily prohibited, you have to kind of have a little bit of forethought and planning in that, in the event of your death, there could be some very big issues caused. Let's see. Getting towards the end here. Pros and cons of using checkbook control. We've kind of covered this, but again, if people are just looking at the slides later on, you have quicker access to the IRA funds is a big pro. You can hold more assets with potentially lower fees. And sometimes you do have the possibility for additional asset protection and anonymity. But keep in mind that it's going to be predominantly based on whatever the state that you register the LLC in, and also the state in which you have your assets in, are going to determine the ability for additional or less liability protection. Some cons: you're responsible for keeping all of your accurate records. You have a lack of oversight by the administrator, and it is definitely easier to engage in prohibited transactions. So what's the best strategy for you? Ultimately, it is a purely personal choice. I always recommend people pay for an hour of an attorney's time, someone that's familiar with this stuff. It is cheap insurance to get someone that is a consummate professional to answer you in a legal capacity. Although many of us at Advanta have many years of experience, 9, 10, 15 years here of doing this. We're not an advisory company. So even if you gave me all of the information, I could not give you an opinion on whether or not it is a good idea for you to do something or not. It is important to make sure that you understand that distinction, that everything we give is for informational purposes only, not a legally advisory opinion. So if the strategy you're looking for has some questions, contact us first. We'll get you a baseline, but ultimately, go to an advisory professional to make sure that you're getting the right answer. Um, and with regards to that, that's pretty much it. If there's any more questions, I'll stick around for a little bit. If you want to learn more about our events, go to advantaira.com. Especially, this kind of is really going to tie into crypto for next week. If you want to learn more about cryptocurrency investing and how to actually do it with procedures on how to interact your LLC with a particular brokerage, how those things work, what it looks like to use cold storage, what it looks like kind of from top to bottom to do these kinds of investments. That's going to be a really good one. I'd recommend it next week. We catalog all of our presentations, so if you want to go back and listen to the audio from this, it's going to be on our YouTube channel by about tomorrow. And then we do an updated blog that has plenty of good information with regards to current events and things that are going on in the retirement market. So keep an eye out for that. Just putting it up here again, we covered exactly how to get started. You just need to fill out an application, you fund the account, and then you start investing. It's really a simple three-step process. There's not too much to it. So with that said, I see some people got their hands up. Ask the question, type it into the box. Like I said, I'll stick around until we have about a third of the amount of people that we had on initially. So we got plenty of people on. So feel free to answer questions. See, Daniel asks, how does all this work with metals? I mean, if you have an LLC, you can certainly buy precious metals. It has to be platinum, silver, gold, or palladium. So keep that in mind, and there are minimum fineness requirements for those. Will UBIT become automatic if using an LLC or a trust? No. UBIT, unrelated business income tax, kicks in if you buy a trader business. So if you have a single member LLC that just invests in real estate, that wouldn't trigger it. But let's say you went and bought a laundromat, right? Well, that would, kind of the UBIT tax essentially levels the playing field, because if you could just buy businesses that would be completely exempt from any tax, then the IRS would be losing out on a ton of revenue. So that's where kind of the UBIT trigger would come in. UDFIT, which is a close stepchild of UBIT, is related to debt financing. So if an IRA has a property and it wants to finance it, you will have a trigger for a type of UBIT in that scenario. Can I store metals at a bank? Yes, but keep in mind that you would need to have a separate storage agreement for the metals if you're doing it underneath the LLC. Couldn't be in your name personally with regard to that storage or safe deposit box. Let's see, for an LLC that owns real estate without a mortgage, what are the annual reports or information that the IRA would need to provide to Advanta? Good question. You just need to provide us with some type of update to value. If an LLC owns real estate, in that case, essentially what you can do is you can provide us with a copy of a comparative market analysis and a copy of the bank statement for the LLC as of 12/31. You can provide us with a copy of the tax bill for the property or properties that you hold. But at bare minimum, we would need to see an unaudited balance sheet, which can just be an Excel spreadsheet, and a copy of the bank statement. Ultimately, you as the manager are responsible for making sure that you keep the backup documentation for providing valuation to the IRA custodian. I see someone has their hand raised. Please just type the question in because audio is muted. So type those in. Still got plenty of people signed on. So again, if you got questions, type them in. We had about 50 people on the call today, and we're down to about 36 still live on the call. So please get those questions in. I'll stick around until there's probably about 15 people left on here. Iva, the IRS does not approve investments. They just give you a list of things that you cannot invest in. So unfortunately, there's not like an approval or disapproval process. So for what that said, the IRS doesn't say you can buy securities. They don't say that you can buy stock. That wouldn't be an approved investment either. They give us guidance on things you can't and the people you can't invest directly with. All right, looks like that we've pretty much. We got one more question. Couple of questions. Let's see. Can an owner do home improvement on real estate without getting? Oh, so can the IRA owner do home improvement without getting paid? No. Let's see. How easy is it to manage notes for a client if they're using a self-directed IRA? I mean, it's as easy as doing it for a personal person, I'd imagine. I mean, having not been a note servicer myself, it's really no different per se on the servicing side than someone that owns them personally. You just need to make sure that the payments are made either back to the LLC that owns the notes or that the payments are just being made directly back to the IRA. But conceptually, there's really no difference. Just making sure that the proper note holder in that case is paid. But if I were to be a note servicer, I really wouldn't see any difference from my experience in this profession to doing something for someone personally. Again, they don't look too far into that. With investments and the IRA approving checkbook LLCs versus unrelated parties, that's just not something that they don't get so specific into that. They just give guidelines on whom you can and can't invest with. And then the rest of the guidelines have kind of been born out of case law that has come up either by IRS tax courts or the like. See, I have some money in a Roth IRA. My wife has money in an IRA. Do we have to form a multi-member LLC if we want to combine assets? I mean, you don't have to. There's other ways to do it. I mean, you could use a trust, but if you want to specifically have them in one entity, yes, you would have to do that. But keep in mind that if you do combine those, one, you're going to have to file a federal tax return, and two, it can cause issues down the road if you try to add more money or something into that LLC from another IRA, not necessarily profit. So while the answer on face value is yes, I would really recommend kind of taking a very comprehensive look to see if that's a good fit. But you could. Let's see. Can you be a partner with your 1031 exchange? Typically, no. There's really not too many reasons where an IRA would need to participate in a 1031. And also, if you're talking about buying or selling the assets for the reallocation of your profits that you're trying to exempt in a 1031 exchange, then that would be self-dealing if you were trying to use IRA assets to buy or sell in that scenario to yourself for a 1031. So if I understand your question correctly, I think the answer would be no. But an IRA can, in instances where it's trying to exempt itself from UBIT or UDFI liabilities, it can participate in a 1031. But again, that's a very specialized kind of niche for IRAs. All right. Well, again, thank you everyone for participating today. Before I go, the asset is a beach condo. Can my wife and I stay there for a week? The answer is no. Sorry. That's a pretty clear cut one on personal utilization of assets in IRA. So again, everyone, thank you very much for attending today. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me via email or phone. All my information is right there on the slide here at the end. Have a great day.